Hey, it's Laura. What you're about to watch is a conversation that I had with Pastor Robert Fergusson. He's been a teacher and a preacher in the Christian world for over 30 years now. We spoke about his first book, Are You Getting This? A great resource if you're wanting to know how to tell a good story, and also the power of using your own stories and life experience to communicate important messages. We dive into how Pastor Robert's rural upbringing in England has shaped some of his own story and love of words, and the value of your daily habits. I hope you enjoy. Pastor Robert, thank you so much for chatting with me. Really appreciate it.
Well, it is wonderful to be with you, Laura. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You've written a book that essentially is about a love for storytelling, a love of communication. When did that fascination begin for you into storytelling?
Well, I've been thinking about this. I think I've always loved storytelling. My parents were great storytellers. We had an uncle who was a great storyteller who would sit us down and regale us with stories. And when my father died, when I was 8 years old, I had a mentor, one of the people that worked for us on our family farm in England, became a sort of mentor, and he would go out for long walks, or I would go out for long walks with him, and he would tell me the most wonderful stories, and I still remember them to this day. So I think I've always loved stories, but it's only in the last few years that I've really understood their significance and power.
Tell us a little bit about your life growing up as a young guy, because I know in the book there's a character called Shadowtail that sort of represents you and a little of your world. Tell us about him and about his connection to your own story.
Okay, well, I went to a boarding school from the age of 8 through to 18, and my father went to the same boarding school, and my father had red hair. So when he was at school, he was called Squirrel. And so when I came to the school in the next generation, automatically the teachers called me Squirrel. So Squirrel was my nickname. And I've even got a letter from the headmaster saying, "Dear Squirrel." So it wasn't just a little thing, it was a big thing. So it just became a normal part of my life. And so when I wanted to choose a character to represent me, it was very simple. I just chose to speak through the world of a squirrel.
I like that. You've picked something fun, something cute, something joyful, but you also are really honest about what that journey was like in the experience of Shadowtail. What are some of the stories that have impacted your own life and the ones that you have been most affected by?
Well, obviously, the Bible stories have been hugely influential and foundational in my life, but I think I'm a great gleaner of stories and storytelling. So there are so many different stories in books and in movies that have impacted me in some form or another. And it would be very difficult just to pick one. But I love the idea that people or God speaks through people, and he speaks through their stories. And so the Bible is just a catalogue of remarkable stories of flawed and different and heroic individuals, and every single one can speak to you. So I'm a watcher of people.
I do like that. I think many of us actually enjoy sitting in cafes and people watching, maybe more than we would admit, whether it is actually at the cafe or in the movies at the moment. But for you as well, your life really has been lived in the telling of stories as a teacher, as a pastor, as a preacher. And we know through history that stories have so much influence on what we know about ourselves as humans, where we form identity. Why do you think stories are so impactful in that kind of life narrative that we all have?
Yes, it's a really interesting question. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, when God spoke to Israel about passing on their covenant values, he told them to encapsulate their ideas in a story. He says, when your children ask you, tell them. And then every Passover, that's exactly what they do. And then when Jesus came to earth, he chose storytelling as his primary form of communication. So in Matthew 13, it says that he never taught anything without telling stories. So I think that sooner or later, we are going to have to be storytellers. Now, I was brought up as a modernist, and modernists in preaching were not storytellers. I was never encouraged to tell my story, but automatically I just told stories. In fact, I used to write stories about animals just for fun and tell them in schools and tell them to my children. And I was even asked to tell stories on the local radio back in the 70s. So I think they've always been incredibly important to me. And I think they are one of the most powerful ways of disseminating truth and passing on something profound to another generation.
Was it kind of strange for you to have lost your dad at such a young age, but then go to the school that he went to and then also be kind of swept up in other people's memories of him and kind of have to carry that legacy in a way? Was that sort of strange?
Well, I don't think so. I've always loved history. So the idea of being part of the generations is very important to me. I was brought up in a village with about 250 people, a very small village in the south of England that was mentioned in the Domesday Book, which was written in 1087. So the village has been there for 1,000 years and 1,000 years before that. And I've always had this idea that we are just part of a long journey of the generations. So the idea of receiving a story from a previous generation and passing it on to the next has always been part of my life. I love history, I love storytelling, and I love that idea of leaving a legacy. So yeah, I don't think it surprised me.
I think that's actually a really cool thing that you didn't feel like it was sort of a pressure point. But when we do hear stories, we often identify with certain characters, or we see ourselves, we see our life playing out in the story we're reading or watching. For you, who is the character that you most identify with?
Well, if it's a classic story, it has lots of archetypes in it, and there are the mentor and the hero and the companion in the story. But to be honest, I have never really seen myself as a heroic figure. And although I'm involved in mentoring and I'm a teacher and an instructor, I've never really seen myself as that mentor. So I've thought about this a lot. I've thought, which of the characters do I most relate to? And I always relate to the coach. So in Chariots of Fire, I didn't relate to Abraham, who ran, or I didn't relate to Eric Liddell. I'm not a runner. I don't see myself as an Olympic athlete. But there was a coach in that movie called Sam Musabini, and it was his story that I engaged with. So I often relate to the coach or the companion. In Lord of the Rings, for instance, I don't relate to Frodo, but I do relate to Sam. So it's all about finding yourself in the story and enabling the story to find your place in the bigger story of the world.
Why do you think those are the characters that you most identify with? Is it purely your personality, or do you think that kind of role of being a supporter, being the coach, that's sort of part of your calling?
I definitely think it is part of my calling. I think our personality and our calling work together. God calls us and helps us to be part of that calling. But I don't see myself as the first person. I see myself as a second man. So a number of years ago, I read a book about Roger Bannister, who broke the 4-minute mile. And again, I wasn't that interested in Roger Bannister, who broke the 4-minute mile. It's never been my aspiration. But there was a chapter in it called The Second Man, or the Great Second Man. And it talked about the person who was second in the race and how he was asked by Roger Bannister to race him because the second man could run the third lap better than Roger Bannister. In other words, Roger Bannister needed him for him to break the record. And I've always seen myself as that second man. I am that person who, in effect, can run the third lap well.
That's Actually so inspiring that you recognize that and accept that, because I think there's probably some people who imagine themselves wanting to be the first man, the person as the hero, the person at the front, but actually they'd be much better as that second man. How do you think you can help people know whether that second man position really is the role for them? Do you reckon they innately know and just have to accept it, or is it something that you need help recognizing?
Well, part of it is just pragmatics. In any race, there's only one winner. In any organization, there's only one leader. And so I think I'm very pragmatic about that. But I also, as I said, am a lover of history. Every great person has someone alongside them that enabled them to do what they do. So Alexander the Great, one of the great generals, had another general alongside him called Parmenio that no one's really ever heard of. But he was that person who enabled Alexander to become great. Hillary, when he climbed Everest for the first time, was accompanied by Tenzing. And if you look at any great achievements in life, you'll always see that there is a second man who will enable that person. There's always a companion. And I don't know whether it's my calling or my personality or both, but I suspect that we've all got to embrace that we're part of a team, and it's only as part of a team, as part of a community, that we can actually fulfill our destiny.
One of the things in the community that you're most recognised for definitely is the teaching and the preaching that you have offered to thousands of people over the years. Surprisingly, though, you do talk about in Are You Getting This? An insecurity that you've always felt about yourself and being in crowds, being in front of so many people. How have you dealt with those feelings, but then also realizing that actually you are called, you are equipped to be in these really public, large environments?
Look, I think I received a calling. It was never my choice to be a teacher. It wasn't my first calling. I've always been terrified of public speaking when I was young, and I never chose that as an option. But to be honest, God arrested me and said, I want you to be a preacher. And I think my nervousness, which still exists, it exists even as I speak to you, is my thorn in the flesh. It enables me to pray more, to draw strength from God more, to access grace more. So to be honest, I don't mind. I've given up worrying about being slightly nervous. And I just do what I have been called to do, which is to teach. And I don't know if you remember the story, but I was in a classroom teaching biology, and God, and this is a strange thing to say for many listeners, but I believe God spoke to me as clear as I am speaking to you. And he said, what are you doing? And I, of course, responded, I'm telling them about a leaf, which is what I was doing at the time in my biology class. And he said, you should be telling them about me. Wow. And I just knew from that moment, it was like all the calls that you read about in the Bible, Paul's call on the Damascus Road, Jonah's call to go to Nineveh. It was so specific, so definite that I have never for once doubted it. But that call didn't take away my nerves. It just made me determined to do the right thing.
And I suppose perhaps it gave you the motivation to step over those nerves because you knew you kind of had to be doing what God called you to do. But the relationship that you describe yourself as having with God in your book, and as we've just heard now as well, for some it would be really surprising, but there'd be others who think, gosh, I wish I had that. I wish I had such an intimate connection and something so personal with God. How can we cultivate that? I mean, obviously everybody's relationship with God is individual, but how do you think we can all cultivate more of a personal fellowship kind of relationship with God?
Well, I think there's a wonderful verse in the Bible, in the book of James, where it says Elijah was a man just like us. He was just an ordinary person, and yet God did extraordinary things through him. And I think any single person can have a close relationship with God. There's a chapter in the book called Fire Overcomes Fear. And I think many people have my same insecurities and my fear, but fire, a passion, a desire to do the right thing, can overcome that. Just like if you're a mum and you're terrified of snakes, but you see your child being threatened by a snake, you will step over that snake, you will remove the snake to get to the child. Well, I see that my fear of public speaking is like that snake. I step over it in order to do the better thing, which is to help and encourage you. And there's another chapter in the book about developing your devotional life. It's not automatic. We've got to develop our life of devotions with God. And there's a chapter in the book specifically about how to do that.
And maybe that's kind of part of what you touch on when you're talking about this idea of the impossibility of the Christian life. Those things like daily devotion and connection to God that we all know as a Christian, we know is part of what's, expected of us, I suppose, in the life of a Christian, but they can feel really tough. When you're talking about the impossibility of the Christian life, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's interesting. Jesus gave an interesting story to his disciples. He said it's more difficult, or it's impossible, basically, for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And he equated it to a camel going through the eye of a needle. And he said it's just as impossible for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, we just find that ridiculous. So what we try and do is try and find a way where that is not impossible, but it is difficult. Because how can it be impossible since the very next chapter, Zacchaeus, who was a very rich man, became a Christian. He entered the kingdom of heaven. So it's not impossible. But actually, Jesus is saying it is impossible. Therefore, you need my help. You need my grace. You need my strength. Everything that you do requires my strength and grace. In fact, Jesus himself said in John chapter 15, he said, apart from me, you can do nothing. And that is a wonderful releasing thing. I can't speak. I can't be a good husband. I can't have great devotions. I can't bring up my children well. It's impossible. But that's where you draw on the grace of God. And the interesting thing is that throughout history, people have tried to make it difficult. Religion has made Christianity difficult, but Jesus made it impossible. And even that gate, there's no such thing. There's no evidence there was ever a gate in Jerusalem called the camel's or the eye of the needle.
Yeah, right.
But historians have said that because they want to make it difficult to enter the kingdom of heaven. It isn't difficult. It's impossible.
And I think it's a really almost, even though in hearing that you think, oh my gosh, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? It's impossible. There's also a huge hope in that because it's made possible through Christ. And that's kind of the beautiful mystery.
That's it. It comes from surrender. It comes from submission. And, we believe in an upside down kingdom. If you want authority, you need to submit. If you want to live, you need to die. If you want to receive, you need to give. It's a completely upside down kingdom. And that's why I love talking about the impossibilities of the Christian faith, because it means that, I can't do this. Exactly. You can't do this. That's exactly what I want you to understand. So you say, well, what do I do? Just say help. That's my favorite prayer. God, help me.
Yeah, and with that, you'll have plenty of things to teach and preach on for many years to come. I have absolutely no doubt. And it's very clear. I've heard you speak on the platform before. I have obviously read the book now as well. You have a real hunger and a value for wisdom. Why is wisdom so important to you?
Look, Jesus, once again, is the personification of wisdom. So it's not just seeking wisdom for wisdom's sake. It is seeking God. And he will give us wisdom. I love the fact that I was brought up on a farm. At the time, I don't think I really understood the significance of it. But I was talking to people yesterday, in fact, about Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 4, where the servant, the suffering servant, the Messiah himself is wakened morning by morning. And God speaks to him and gives him wisdom so that he can sustain the weary. It's a wonderful verse. about Jesus and how he has a word to sustain the weary. But it's also our story. And being brought up on a farm, I had to go, for instance, down to the farm every morning and collect the milk. And you have to, on a farm, you have to milk the cows every morning in winter or in summer. It makes absolutely no difference. And that idea of daily routines, daily rhythms, daily drawing from God, because obviously the milk of the Word of God is written about in the Bible. But I just see the two as similar. So when I get up in the morning, I, in effect, go and collect the milk morning by morning, doesn't matter what the situation is. And then once I've received that, I will have a word that sustains the weary.
Wow. I think that's actually really challenging for a lot of us to think of our daily responsibilities, our daily life in that kind of way. And surely growing up on a farm has also given you a real appreciation for a lot of the parables that Jesus told. You've almost got that first-hand understanding of what he's talking about when he references all of these kind of agricultural ways of living.
I think that's absolutely true. And I remember once preaching in Pakistan many, many years ago, and we were walking in a very, very desolate area. And we came to a small village, and these wonderful people had absolutely no understanding of where I'd come from or what my values were or what I stood for. And they literally sat on a ground in a circle, all these farmers, and they asked me to tell them a story. And I thought, well, what on earth do you tell a group of farmers in Pakistan? I think they were growing chilies. And I just sat and I told them the parable of the sower. And I'll never forget it because I understand agriculture. This was their world. This was their life. And I just told them that story. And not only does it talk about the power of stories, but it talks about the power of images that relate to people.
And that's, I think, one of Jesus' greatest abilities, I suppose. I mean, yes, he was God, of course, but I think being able to relate to people and create these pictures of things that really showed that he understood their life and valued their stories, I think is just so beautiful. But as a preacher and teacher yourself, there's also a lot of responsibility you carry to talk about things that not only help us understand our own life and perhaps improve the way we live, but sometimes to talk about really hard issues. And there's an expectation on pastors sometimes to talk about big ticket social items, and churches can be criticised for not getting in there enough with some of the challenges that our world faces from a social perspective. Do you think that's the case, that pastors don't always talk enough about social issues? Is it something you think we can be doing better or not so much?
Look, obviously, every single one of us is in the world and we have a responsibility to that world. And Jesus put it like this: your responsibility, my responsibility is to love God and to love our neighbor. So we've got to ask ourselves how to love our neighbor effectively. But I don't think that preachers who are called to preach should be that involved in politics. Now, if you are called to be in politics or called to be involved in social issues, that is a slightly different thing. But if you remember my calling, God said to me, I want you to tell people about me. And when I do that, I actually do talk about big ticket issues. As you put it, I talk about righteousness. I talk about death. I talk about eternity. I talk about all the things that we need as human beings. So I think preachers and teachers in church usually do talk about the big ticket issues, and that's why often they're criticized. Now, should we be talking about some of the challenges? Well, as I said, I think my job is to point people to hope, point people to life, point people to truth, and all those things are found in Jesus. So I actually think I do address the difficult issues, but in a slightly different way than maybe a politician.
Staying in your lane, I guess, is kind
Staying
of...
in your lane. I think so.
One way to look at it, for sure. And as someone who has been in church for such a long time. I think it's actually admirable, the longevity that you've demonstrated and the many seasons that you will have had to ride out as a Christian yourself and as part of a large church community would just be endless, I think. So how do you think we can all have that kind of longevity, whether it's in our personal faith, but also in a broader church community?
Well, to retell some of the conversation, because I'm a historian, when I go through a tough season, like we're going through right now, I look back at history and I look at all the various pandemics and the various plagues that have plagued our world. And I see that this is a season that eventually will pass. And again, being brought up on a farm helps me immeasurably. Seasons pass. Every one of us goes through seasons. And the seasons aren't just something to endure, they're something to embrace. So there are 4 seasons. We need the loss of autumn to move into the waiting of winter. We need the waiting of winter to move into the life of spring or the hope of spring. And we need the hope of spring to move into the fruitfulness of harvest. And once you've received a harvest, you need loss again. So God has created this cyclical world that involves loss, waiting, hope, and fruitfulness. And because I've been brought up on a farm, we're going through a season of loss. We're going through a season of waiting at the moment. But there is hope. There is harvest in the future. So one of the keys to longevity is just keep doing the right thing. And going back to my milking the cows analogy, I was on a farm recently talking to a cowman. And I said, well, I was brought up on a farm. I understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I said, how long have you been doing this, milking the cows? And he said, 50 years.
Wow.
And I said, so every day. And then I can't tell you exactly what he said because he colored his language somewhat. But he basically said, yes, every day for 50 years. And that is, for me, the key to longevity. People say to me, how do you have a great marriage? I've been married for 45 years or 44 years. And I've been a Christian for 45 years. And people say, how do you do that? I say, keep doing the right thing. That's it. How do you build a great relationship? Keep doing the right thing. And the key is the keeping.
Yeah, and I think that having the energy and the motivation, the focus to just keep doing the right thing every day.
If you don't milk the cows, they die, and you have no future.
Yeah, I very much like the way you put that, Pastor Robert. And people must have noticed while listening to this conversation, watching it as well, the beautiful bookshelf that you do have behind you. I'm assuming it's not fake and that the books are real. No. So which one's your favorite there?
Look, on that particular level, I'm not so sure. I don't really have favorite books or favorite messages or favorite preachers, to be honest, because I think there's a great idea in nearly every book. So when I read books, I just look for a great idea.
Well, you have certainly shared a whole bunch in your book. Are You Getting This? And with us today, Pastor Robert. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. I really appreciate the opportunity and the privilege to speak to you. I hope it's helped all your listeners. And of course, I hope you get it.